Ziweveric Ven had always considered himself well prepared. His meticulous studies had earned him top placement in the Zaloxian Scholastic Consortium, granting him the rare honor of an off-world exchange program at the prestigious Sunspire Academy. He had spent an entire lunar cycle preparing for this assignment, researching the social customs of the Academy's multi-species student body, absorbing linguistic databases, and even familiarizing himself with humor, despite his species having no innate sense of it. He had anticipated cultural misunderstandings. He had braced himself for unpredictable interactions. What he had not anticipated, what no briefing, no xenoanthropological report, and no amount of logical reasoning could have possibly prepared him for, was the moment his human roommate began peeling his own skin off. Ziweveric's luminescent spots flared erratically as his mind scrambled to make sense of the absolute horror unfolding before him. Across the room, his fellow dorm mate, Shithkar, stood equally frozen, his bioceramic scales rippling through a series of stress-induced color shifts. Danny, the human in question, was standing at the shared bathroom sink, his shirt halfway unbuttoned, staring at his own arm with mild annoyance. "Ah, man," Danny muttered, scratching at his forearm. A thin, curling strip of flesh detached from his skin. He frowned at it. "Not again." Ziweveric's gill slits flared. Shithkar hissed sharply. Danny, completely oblivious to their silent mounting terror, nonchalantly rolled his shoulder, revealing even more detaching skin across his exposed collarbone. He absent-mindedly scratched at his arm again, peeling another piece of himself away. Ziweveric felt his vision blur. Shithkar finally found his voice, his normally measured, reptilian tone cracking slightly. "Human." His pupils were fully contracted, a clear sign of stress. "You are molting." Danny turned his head toward them, blinking. "Huh." Ziweveric stepped back. His mind raced. No, this wasn't possible. Nowhere in the Academy's extensive archives on human physiology had it mentioned spontaneous skin detachment. I did not know humans shed their own flesh," Ziweveric managed, his voice rising in pitch. "Is this a regenerative adaptation? A defensive measure? Are you in the process of sloughing away diseased tissue?" Danny squinted at them for a long moment, then let out a short laugh. "Oh, okay, I get it now." Ziweveric was not reassured. Danny grinned and waved his peeling arm. "Dudes, I'm not molting. It's just a sunburn. You know, I was outside too long the other day, and now my skin's just flaking a little. No big deal. No big deal. No big deal." Ziweveric's brain refused to process this. Danny saw his expression and, as if to make things worse, scratched at his shoulder again, sending yet another sheet of flesh drifting to the floor. Ziweveric nearly collapsed. Shithkar made a series of sharp hiss clicks, his scales shifting into a deep reddish-black, Arilvian distress response. "You discard portions of your dermal layer due to excessive exposure to your own sun? You do not find this alarming?" Danny shrugged. "It happens. It'll stop in a day or two." "A day or two." Ziweveric turned sharply to Shithkar, barely keeping his voice under control. "We need to go. Now." Shithkar did not argue. The two of them exited the dormitory without another word. Danny, still standing at the sink, watched them go, completely baffled. "Ha!" he muttered to himself, rubbing his chin. "Guess they don't have sunburns where they're from." Then, with zero concern, he flicked another strip of dead skin into the trash and went to make himself a sandwich. 12 hours earlier, Ziweveric had been excited. Genuinely, truly excited. Stepping onto the gleaming campus of Sunspire Academy, he had taken in the grand, multi-species university with reverence. The towering crystalline structures reflected the soft light of Epsilon Voridis twin suns, casting golden beams across the walkways. Hundreds of students from dozens of different species milled about, engaged in lively discussions, exchanging knowledge from across the stars. He had anticipated challenges. He had mentally prepared himself for the cultural and linguistic barriers that would arise from studying alongside so many different life forms. But he had not been prepared for a human roommate. The moment he read the dormitory assignments, he had stared at the name in disbelief. Danny Alvarez. A human. The briefing reports on humans were woefully insufficient. What little information existed in the interstellar archives contradicted itself constantly. Some sources claimed humans were fragile, easily wounded, susceptible to disease, requiring specific atmospheric conditions to survive. Others described them as inexplicably durable, capable of withstanding extreme gravitational shifts, possessing an alarming pain tolerance, and, most unsettlingly, thriving in unstable environments. Which one was it? When Ziweveric had first entered his assigned dormitory in Unit 47B, he had been greeted by Shithkar, who had arrived earlier. The two of them had exchanged polite introductions, quickly establishing a mutual understanding. Then, the door to one of the sleeping pods had slid open, and Danny had stumbled out. Literally stumbled. He had fallen out of bed, landed in a heap on the floor, groaned, stretched in the manner of a predatory mammal, and blinked blearily at them. "Oh," he mumbled, running a hand through his unruly mammalian hair. "Yo. Roommates. Cool." Ziweveric had immediately known. This was going to be a disaster. And he had been right. Danny was loud. He laughed constantly. He used slang that was completely indecipherable. He consumed food that probably counted as biological warfare and displayed zero survival instincts at any given time. But even with all that, Ziweveric had not expected today's revelation. Because nothing, in his extensive research had ever mentioned that humans were capable of spontaneous skin detachment. And yet, here they were. Ziweveric paced back and forth outside the dormitory, his hands trembling. "We need to find a professor," he said. "Or the medical department. We need to confirm if this is. He cut himself off, trying to compose himself. "If this is actually normal." Shithkar took a long, slow breath through his nostrils. His scales were still darkened in stress. "I do not know what is more unsettling," he admitted. "The fact that the human is shedding his flesh, or the fact that he does not seem to care." Ziweveric felt a shudder ripple through him. "I fear," he said gravely, "that we have severely underestimated the true horror of human biology." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Shithkar nodded. "I concur." Ziweveric Ven was many things, scholarly, meticulous, and exceptionally rational, but at this moment, as he sat hunched over his data slate, furiously scouring every xenobiology database he could access, he was one thing above all: terrified. His human roommate was molting, and no one seemed to think this was a problem. Ziweveric's fingers trembled as he flipped through the database entries, his bioluminescent spots flickering erratically in distress. Shithkar sat across from him, his own data slate in hand, his bioceramic scales still darkened from lingering unease. They had retreated to the Academy's xenomedical archives, hoping, desperately, to find some kind of official confirmation that what they had witnessed was either a mistake or a biological anomaly. Instead, they found nothing. Or rather, they found plenty of human medical data, but no mention of spontaneous flesh shedding. They had scoured entries on wound regeneration, cellular mitosis, immune system efficiency, epidermal structure, and even radiation damage recovery. Yet nowhere in these records did it mention that humans routinely discarded their own dermal layers. Ziweveric's breathing hitched. He turned to Shithkar, voice tight with barely contained hysteria. "The databases. Do not mention it." Shithkar exhaled slowly. "Concerning." Ziweveric clenched his jaw. "More than concerning. If this were a documented biological function, it would be listed. Which means that humans have either failed to disclose this horrifying trait to the wider galaxy," his voice dropped to a whisper, "or they do not consider it significant enough to report." Shithkar visibly tensed. Ziweveric's mind reeled. What else did humans neglect to mention? Did their bones detach? Did their teeth fall out? Did they casually regrow limbs? Ziweveric took a shaky breath. He needed more information. And unfortunately, that meant he had to return to the source of the horror itself. They returned to their dormitory with cautious apprehension. Danny was sprawled across the common room couch, lazily tossing a snack into his mouth while watching a holoscreen. As soon as he saw them, he grinned. "Hey, you guys disappeared earlier. Thought maybe you got vaporized or something." He snickered. Would have sucked to have to fill out a missing persons report on day 3. Ziweveric did not find this amusing. He took a slow, measured step forward. "Human Danny." Danny raised an eyebrow at the formality. "Yeah. Zwyveric's gill slits fluttered. We require further clarification about your condition. Danny blinked. My condition? Shithkar crossed his arms, his expression grim. The molting. Danny stared. Then, to Zwyveric's growing frustration, he laughed. Oh my God, you guys are still freaked out about that? He shook his head. Dudes. I told you. It's just a sunburn. Shithkar's eyes narrowed. You expect us to believe that exposure to your own star causes your skin to disintegrate? Danny shrugged. Not all the time. Just when we get too much UV radiation. Zwyveric's bioluminescence flickered wildly. Too much radiation. Shithkar let out an audible hiss-click. You sustain radiation damage so frequently that your species considers minor epidermal loss a normal event? Danny gave them both an odd look. I mean, yeah. Zwyveric felt his pulse spike. This was it. This was the moment he realized humans were an existential anomaly. They were walking, breathing radiation-resistant anomalies. Zwyveric sucked in a sharp breath. He had to confirm the worst of his suspicions. Tell me, Danny, if a human were to sustain excessive injury. Danny frowned. Dude, why do you sound like you're planning a murder? Zwyveric ignored him. Would they also be capable of shedding larger portions of their dermal layer? Danny squinted. You mean like scarring? Shithkar stiffened. Scarring? Danny nodded. Yeah. If we get hurt bad enough, sometimes our skin doesn't grow back the same way. Or if it's a really deep cut, sometimes you can still see where the wound was. He tapped his chin, thinking. Actually, I've got a scar right. Then, with absolutely no warning, Danny lifted his shirt. Both Zwyveric and Shithkar recoiled violently. There, stretched across Danny's lower abdomen, was a long, jagged stripe of discolored flesh. Zwyveric stumbled backward so quickly he nearly tripped. Shithkar's scales flashed an alarmed shade of violet. You are damaged. Danny snorted. Nah, dude. It's old. Got it when I was like 12. Tried to ride a hoverboard off a roof, and it didn't end well. Zwyveric's brain shut down. Off a roof. You sustained major bodily harm from gravitational impact, Zwyveric's voice cracked. And your solution was to continue living as if nothing happened? Danny laughed. I mean, what else was I supposed to do? It's not like I could unfall off the roof. Zwyveric clutched his head. They were insane. Humans were completely and utterly insane. Shithkar let out a low exhale, his claws flexing slightly. How did your people ever survive as a species? Danny stretched. Dunno, man. Luck. Stubbornness. Also, did you guys know that if you lose a fingernail, it grows back? Freaky, right? Zwyveric made a horrible noise somewhere between a gasp and a strangled whimper. Shithkar looked visibly ill. Danny, finally picking up on their continued distress, frowned. Okay, real talk. Are you guys actually okay? Zwyveric took a deep breath. No. He was not okay. Because humans weren't just resilient. They were biological anomalies capable of withstanding an impossible level of bodily damage with casual indifference. And somehow, the entire universe had failed to document this. Zwyveric's hands trembled. I need to sit down, he muttered. Danny patted his shoulder. You should drink some water, man. Zwyveric flinched at the touch. He was sure that if he stayed around Danny much longer, he was going to have some kind of cardiac event. Shithkar, meanwhile, stood stiffly before shaking his head. Hey, I must process this. With that, the Rilvian turned sharply and left the dormitory, his posture unusually rigid. Zwyveric hesitated for one more moment before following. Danny watched them both go, then shrugged. Man, he muttered to himself, tossing another snack into his mouth. Aliens are weird. Zwyveric Ven was going to die. He had survived countless academic trials, mastered interstellar diplomacy, and achieved top marks in all preparatory coursework for his semester at Sunspire Academy. Yet none of that mattered now, because he was trapped in a high-speed, uncontrolled death spiral, and the worst part? His human roommate was laughing. Zyvaric's bioluminescent spots flared in sheer terror as the hovercraft they were currently aboard lurched violently to the left, skimming the edge of a gravity stabilizer field and nearly throwing them into open air. Danny hooped. Whoa. Now this is what I'm talking about. Shithkar let out a harsh reptilian shriek as he clung to the vehicle's stabilizer rail for dear life. His bioceramic scales had gone completely black, a rare color shift that Zyvaric was certain meant something akin to impending death. Danny Alvarez, you incompetent, primitive mammal, you are going to kill us. Danny, grinning like an absolute madman, barely glanced over his shoulder. Come on, Shithkar, chill. I got this. Zyvaric's entire nervous system rejected that statement. Danny did not have this. Danny was piloting a malfunctioning student hovercraft at absurdly dangerous speeds through the upper levels of the campus grav-racing circuit, a place explicitly labeled for advanced pilots only. Danny was not an advanced pilot. He wasn't even supposed to be here. And yet, here they were. The disaster had begun hours earlier when Zyvaric, still recovering from his horrifying discovery of human spontaneous skin detachment, had foolishly agreed to accompany Danny on what he had described as a quick test drive. That had been mistake number 1. Mistake number 2 had been assuming Danny knew what the words quick and test actually meant. Now, Zyvaric and Shithkar were aboard a hovercraft accelerating far beyond safe velocity, soaring between gravity rings at speeds that would shatter the bones of lesser species. And Danny, the lunatic, the absolute hazard to interstellar civilization, was having the time of his life. Oh, hell yeah! Danny shouted as they hit a steep vertical climb, the hovercraft momentarily losing traction before slamming into the next section of the track. I think I just figured out the drift timing. Watch this. No, do not watch this. Zyvaric screamed. Danny yanked the controls, sending the craft into a sharp barrel roll. Shithkar hissed in sheer terror. I am too young for this. Zyvaric's entire life flashed before his eyes. 3 hours earlier. Come on, man, just one lap. I need to see if this baby still runs. Zyvaric had squinted at Danny with deep suspicion. You do not own a hovercraft. Danny grinned. Well, not technically. I borrowed it. Shithkar narrowed his reptilian eyes. From whom? Danny made a vague hand gesture that did not, in fact, answer the question. Zyvaric's gill slits flared. This was a terrible idea. He knew this. And yet, somehow, someway, Danny had convinced them both to accompany him to one of the campus advanced grav-racing circuits. At first, things had seemed manageable. The hovercraft had powered on smoothly. The initial acceleration had been reasonable. Then, Danny had smirked. I bet I can hit the next ring without braking. And that was the precise moment Zyvaric realized they were doomed. Danny, stop this vehicle immediately. Zyvaric was seconds from cardiac failure as the hovercraft careened into a corkscrew loop, the artificial gravity barely keeping them from being launched into the void. Danny laughed again, gripping the controls with zero concern for his own mortality. Dudes, we're fine. This baby's got stabilization dampeners. A warning alarm blared. Warning stabilization failure. Danny blinked. That's probably not great. Zyvaric lost his mind. I am exiting this vehicle, he shrieked, reaching for the emergency eject panel. Danny immediately grabbed his wrist. Dude, bad idea. No, bad idea was trusting a human to operate a vehicle. Shithkar let out a strangled growl. If we survive this, I will personally ensure you are banned from operating machinery for the remainder of your existence. Danny rolled his eyes. You guys are such babies. A massive gravitational shift hit. The hovercraft pitched violently to the side, spinning out of control as the stabilizers failed entirely. Warning collision imminent. Zyvaric screamed. Shithkar screamed. Danny grinned. All right, hold on to your butts. And then he did something absolutely insane. Instead of braking, instead of course-correcting, instead of trying literally anything remotely rational, Danny accelerated. No, you absurd mammal, Zyvaric shrieked. Danny jerked the hovercraft sideways, aiming directly for the outermost gravity stabilizer. The second they hit the field's edge, Danny slammed the manual override, cutting power to the stabilizers just long enough for the artificial gravity to slingshot them around the loop. Zywaverek could not even comprehend what was happening. One moment, they were spinning into certain death. The next, they were perfectly aligned with the final stretch of track, stabilizers re-engaging just as the hovercraft regained balance. Danny whooped. Nailed it! The vehicle skidded to a stop just past the finish line, hissing from overheated thrusters. There was silence. Then, Shithkar rolled out of the hovercraft and collapsed onto the ground, visibly shaking. Zywaverek remained frozen in his seat, unable to form coherent thoughts. Danny stretched his arms over his head. Well, that was fun. Zywaverek's bioluminescence flickered wildly, a clear sign of impending neurological overload. Fun, he rasped. Fun. I have never been closer to the cold embrace of death. Danny grinned. But we didn't die, though. Shithkar, face down in the dirt, let out a low, exhausted groan. Never again. Danny laughed. Dude, you guys gotta lighten up. Zywaverek finally snapped. Humans are a threat to interstellar stability. Danny snorted. Bro, it was just a little turbulence. Zywaverek let out an incoherent noise of distress. Shithkar slowly dragged himself to his feet. If we report this, you are going to be banned from piloting for the rest of your natural life. Danny grinned. If you don't report it, we can totally do another round tomorrow. Zywaverek and Shithkar exchanged a glance. Then, in perfect unison, we are reporting this. Zywaverek Ven was done. Not mildly annoyed. Not moderately inconvenienced. Done. For the past 3 days, he had endured unspeakable horrors. Day 1. He discovered that humans shed their own skin. Casually. Without concern. Day 2. He learned that they could sustain massive bodily injury, form permanent scars, and still function as if nothing happened. Day 3. He almost died in a high-speed hovercraft disaster because his human roommate had the impulse control of an asteroid on a collision course. And yet, somehow, someway, against all logic and reason, they were all still alive. Zywaverek couldn't even comprehend how. He sat on the dormitory couch, his limbs trembling from residual stress. Across from him, Shithkar was equally shaken, his bioceramic scales still locked in a dark, distressed shade. Danny was perfectly fine. In fact, he was eating a sandwich. So, Danny said between bites, "Are you guys gonna report me, or nah?" Shithkar and Zywaverek turned their heads in perfect synchronization, their expressions blank. Danny took another bite. Chewed. Swallowed. I feel like that's a yes. Zywaverek's eye twitched. 3 hours earlier. The moment they had dragged themselves out of the hovercraft, Zywaverek and Shithkar had marched straight to campus administration. The incident report had been brutally detailed. Unauthorized use of a hovercraft? White heavy checkmark. Endangerment of fellow students? White heavy checkmark. Violating interspecies safety protocols? White heavy checkmark. General recklessness beyond any reasonable standard? White heavy checkmark, white heavy checkmark, white heavy checkmark. The response from Dean Vialeric, a stern, four-eyed Arcanian, had been immediate. Mr. Alvarez, you are hereby banned from piloting any school-owned vehicle for the duration of your academic stay. Zywaverek had felt a wave of relief. Finally, justice. Danny, however, had simply shrugged. Worth it. Zywaverek's bioluminescence glitched in pure frustration. Zywaverek exhaled, trying to calm his overworked nervous system. Shithkar let out a slow, measured breath. You are reckless, irresponsible, and a danger to yourself and others. Danny grinned. But fun, though. Zywaverek gripped the sides of his head. Fun is not the objective of survival. Danny laughed. Zywaverek felt his will to live diminish. There was a long pause. Then, after a moment, Danny leaned forward. All right, serious question. What's the wildest thing your species can do? Zywaverek blinked. What? Danny shrugged. Like, humans have, you know, crazy pain tolerance, fast healing, and sick reflexes. What do you guys have? Zywaverek scoffed. I am a Zelaxian. Our people possess superior cognitive processing, precise bioluminescent communication, and adaptive atmospheric filtration. We do not need wild traits to survive. We rely on logic and strategy. Danny squinted. So, you guys are just really smart. Zyveric bristled. I would hardly reduce millennia of intellectual evolution to just really smart. Danny turned to Shithkar. What about you? Got any cool alien powers? Shithkar hissed. Rilvians possess an advanced exoskeletal structure that grants us superior impact resistance. Danny's eyes lit up. Wait, so you're like armored? Shithkar shifted slightly. In a manner of speaking. Danny grinned. Okay, now I kinda wanna see if I can punch you. Zyveric choked. Shithkar's slit pupils dilated. I beg your pardon. Danny held up his hands. Not like to hurt you. Just, scientifically. For curiosity reasons. Zyveric stared at him in mute horror. You are banned from piloting, and now you wish to engage in combat with an armored reptilian? Danny laughed. Oh, come on. It's not combat. It's science. Shithkar looked at Zyveric. Zyveric looked at Shithkar. Then, without a word, they both stood and walked out of the dormitory. Danny blinked. Okay, now you guys are just being dramatic. Later that night, Zyveric sat in the university's library, staring blankly at his data slate. His mind was in turmoil. He had come to Sunspire Academy expecting to expand his knowledge, to study new cultures, to deepen his understanding of the universe. Instead, he had spent the last 4 days in a state of near-constant existential crisis. And the worst part? He was starting to understand Danny. Not approve of him. Not agree with his insane decision-making. But understand. Because for all of Danny's recklessness, for all of his absurd, borderline self-destructive behavior, there was something undeniably efficient about humans. They were chaotic, yes. Unpredictable, absolutely. But they were also highly adaptable. They didn't just endure difficult situations. They thrived in them. Zyveric sighed, rubbing his temples. I am going to die before the semester is over. Shithkar, seated across from him, let out a low, exhausted grumble. If we are lucky, it will be quick. There was a long silence. Then Zyveric muttered, I will admit. The human's reflexes were impressive. Shithkar did not respond immediately. Then, after a moment, yes. Annoyingly so. Another pause. Then, I wonder if his species could withstand a controlled toxin exposure. Shithkar slammed his data slate on the table. Do not encourage him. Back in the dormitory, Danny was lying on the couch, tossing a snack into the air and catching it in his mouth. Man, he muttered to himself, grinning. Aliens are so weird.